Good luck.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lat Mackey, and this is Sequence Break, episode 53, Feasel. Feasel, thank you so much for joining. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing well. How are you?
I am good. When I try to describe what you do in the speedrunning community, there's so many things to list off here, but it seems like nowadays I still see you hosting GDQs. I don't know if that's still a thing, but well, we haven't had in-person events, but SpeedGaming, speedrunner. I mean, I don't even know where to start at this point, but
yeah, it's tough. I don't know where to start either. It's a tough question when people ask me, what do I do in the speedrun community?
Well, let's first start with this then. Let's take it all back. And if you wouldn't mind, how did you get your start in gaming? What games did you play as a kid? Like, what are some of the things you might have grown up with?
My start in gaming. Well, I got an Atari 2600 used from garage sale when I was very little, and played the heck out of those games. It was probably one of my favorite things to do was to play video games. And then when the NES came out, that was, I was among the first in line to get it, or at least among my friends I was, and it was really one of my favorite things. I just was completely in love with playing Nintendo games, and it seems that a lot of my friend group was sort of centered around playing games as well, trading games with each other, talking about that. We used to play all kinds of things. We'd play Dungeons and Dragons, we'd play various games that we made up, but of course, video games were the hot thing at the time, so spent a lot of time playing those. So primarily 8-bit, and then Super Nintendo, I got into that, of course. And then by the time the PlayStation 1 came out, I was kind of getting on in high school and whatnot, and other, I had other interests and activities and things that kind of took my focus away from that. So I took sort of a hiatus for quite a number of years. It was much later in my life that I actually started picking the games up again, but I didn't really play much of anything until I got into graduate school, and I dug out my old NES and just started playing the games that I had, just the cartridges that I had. I put it up in my office so I could, play it when I had some downtime. And I guess that kind of dovetails into how I got into speedrunning, because I didn't really have a lot of games that I had pulled out of the box. Most of them were still off in an attic somewhere. And so I had, I think it was Contra was probably the thing I had most in that system. And that's a game where once you beat it, you start again at the beginning. And I would just leave the thing running all the time. And every time I had a free moment, I would just sit down and play some more until, my lives ran out, or until I, had to do something else. And then eventually, after playing through it enough times, I realized, hey, this is something that's actually not as hard as I thought it was. I thought this was the hardest game in the world when I was a kid, but when you do it enough times, you kind of know where all the enemies are going to appear. It's just sort of naturally you kind of want to speedrun it.
I got to be honest, I'm a bit surprised you mentioned the Atari was your first console, as I primarily discovered you and knew you for a lot of NES games that you had run and stuff. So that's interesting. Did you ever revisit the Atari later on in life like you did the Nintendo? Unfortunately,
that got sold at some point after I moved out of the house. I don't know where my old Atari went, and I just, just because all my Atari and my games disappeared, it was the NES that I ended up spending the most time with when I went back to revisit that stuff later on in life.
That's a common theme of almost anybody who's been on the podcast, is you kind of play what you have, right? Like, I mean, we, especially back when we were growing up as kids, we usually only had one console in the house, or two if we're lucky,
Sure, yeah. I mean, I wasn't picky. I mean, at the time that I got the Atari, it was already a pretty old console. It was basically about time for the Nintendo era to begin, but it's what we had, so that's what I played. But yeah, I mean, I think that the NES was an enormous step up from anything that came before it. So,
right.
There's a reason why those games still get played a lot and the Atari games don't. That jump up in complexity was just enough to bring it into sort of the modern era of engagement, that we expect from games.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting you pointed out something like Contra, where it's a game that seems so challenging as a kid. I just recently played through it and finally beat it as an adult, 30 years later after the games come out. And It's so interesting, the perspective of how when these games first came out, they seemed so challenging. And some of these games still are incredibly challenging still to this day. But having the perspective as an adult, and at this point, I mean, you have many years under your belt of speedrunning, myself included. It's like the approach, it seems a little less daunting when trying to take on some of those things as an adult. Did you have that experience when you were pulling those games out? You mentioned grad school, things like that. Did they still seem challenging at that point, or were you able to grasp with their difficulty a little better?
Yeah, I mean, I think it helped that, I mean, having an adult brain really helps. I mean, you can't underestimate the reflexes and the hand-eye coordination that kids have. That is something that kind of declines a little bit as you get older, but it's more than made up for by the fact that you just have a full adult brain, so you can really analyze everything that's going on to the extent that I never would have been able to as a kid. And I think that makes a big difference because, it didn't take me long before I didn't even need the 30 lives code to get through the game. It really just, muscle memory and such was just kind of locked in there.
As you rediscovered your NES and some of these classic games, were you still doing any modern gaming at the time? Did you have any experience, N64 on anything past that, GameCube, anything like that? Oh gosh.
Yeah, I was so out of the loop. Like I played a couple of like PSX games, just in college and such, just because I had friends who played those, but for the most part it wasn't until like much later in my life that I played most of the N64 games I played, or the PS2 and anything beyond that. But what I actually was kind of getting into before I got into speedrunning, what I actually was doing, the one thing that caused me to buy I would say modern in, quotes, because it was like a PS2, which was even old at the time that I got it. But I got it because I got into DDR, and, one of my roommates was playing DDR a lot. So I had to get a PS2, and I really found myself just getting like obsessed with getting perfect scores in as many songs as I can, just get perfect score. And then from there, when Rock Band came out on the 360, I had to get one of those because I was just hooked on rhythm games at that point. And I quickly found myself getting into the world of getting optimal scores in it was mostly drums, guitar, and bass. I never was too good at doing the vocals. That's tough. Getting max points in vocals is kind of tricky. But I found that the whole world of like point squeezing and manipulating the fine-grained timing to be able to squeeze extra points out of the musical phrases and such. And I thought the optimization aspect of it really appealed to me. I've always really liked logic puzzles and optimization and such. And then, I discovered that there were whole websites where people would, run algorithms on things to try to like figure out, new solutions to things that hadn't been there before. And that kind of got me into this sort of analytical thinking that I think eventually led to my interest in speedrunning. But that was before I even, started speedrunning anything. I was a rhythm game person.
That's so fascinating you mentioned that, because first of all, I remember, Guitar Hero, Rock Band, Garage Band, all these games being really popular when they came out. And when I saw people do them at such a high level, because I enjoyed playing them just like anybody else, but I couldn't, I wasn't very good at these. I just thought they were like almost born with it, or this is something they had natural to them. But it sounds, you're mentioning that there was information being shared. This sounds similar to what we see sometimes in speedrunning, where there was people doing analysis of the game.
Yeah, and this was before, so this probably would have been the mid-aughts, like 2004-ish, I say, give or take. And it wasn't maybe until 2007 or so that I started actually speedrunning. But at that time, there really weren't a lot. I mean, there was SDA and there was test videos, which at the time was called NES videos. And those were the only sites on the internet that had any kind of strategic discussion of anything as far as like, single player games go, like speedrunnable games. But the rhythm game community actually had a pretty well developed, set of websites and resources and things like that. So there was a big community for those games before there was one for speedrunning.
That's so interesting. And you mentioned that it kind of leads into your speed running. So what was like the first game that maybe you attempted, or how does that interest in gaming lead into attempting, to play a game over and over again to do it as fast as you can?
Yeah, I mean, it really was just me kind of idle playing this game whenever I had some downtime in my office, or when I was kind of working on a problem that I couldn't figure out and I just needed some time. I just would, I I left the thing running all the time. And like I said, it was just Contra. That was the only game that I did at first. And after just playing through it enough times, I'm like, man, I wonder how long it actually would take me to just, if I just sat down and played this start to finish, how long would it take me? And I was getting times of like 20 something minutes. And I'm like, wow, it's impressive. I don't even need the lives code anymore. And I thought, how much faster could I get this? At the time, I didn't know what speedrunning was. There wasn't a lot of... So this has got to be around 2006, 2007. Probably 2007, I think, is when I started like actually seriously thinking about, how fast am I going in this game? And I remember doing some searching around on the internet just to see if there were other... if anyone else had thought of doing the same thing, and it turns out that there were. Most of the videos came from either task videos or from Speed Demo's archive, and that's when I saw a run by CrocDoc, Ray Cullen, who had been at that time the record holder for Contra, although there wasn't really a lot of competition other than him, I think, at that point. And so I'm like, all right, I'm going to try to beat this guy. And that kind of that's the first time I actually had a target. And that's the first time I ever thought of it as something competitive rather than just a thing that I do myself kind of, obsessively for my own amusement. And so that kind of, once I achieved that, then I started looking at, what are the other games? What are the games that I really like or what would I want to play? And I pulled out Double Dragon 2. And at the time, there wasn't really a record for it. Even... I think Twin Galaxies had some really terrible run that wasn't even, or it wasn't, that I could definitely beat. So I was kind of just made the strats up myself, and because you couldn't see videos of Twin Galaxies, and so then I did Double Dragon 2, did some runs of that, and by then I finally made my way into the forums at Speed Demo's archive back in the late 2000s. And started, the forums were amazing. Like I still have this nostalgic feeling when I, think about it or look at, the forums as they exist now. But that was just this whole world of people that had this one, really, bizarre specific interest. And, I would check that every day religiously once I kind of got into that world.
I've been piecing together a lot of kind of the earlier history of speedrunning and tried to get a hold of people like yourself and others who were around that time. And the last person I spoke with was Frezzy Man, and he was just pointing out, he almost said the exact same thing, that once he had discovered SDA, it was all of a sudden there was other people who are interested in this stuff that I am. And, we almost take for granted nowadays that how easy it is. I can share information on a Discord or on, so many places to get, share speedrunning strats, things like that. But he said back then it was quite different, but that just felt like there was this new connection. And it sounds like where a lot of speedrunning was met, and, you could do a lot of stuff happened, it seemed like, from SDA and the forums there.
Yeah, that was really, that and task videos were really the only places that were, truly, organized communities around the sport. And yeah, Frezzy Man was working on Contra at about the same time as me. And I think he got his record like about the same time I did. I'm not even sure which one came first. I may have had the record in Contra for a week, or I may not have. I'm not actually sure, but because he was also working on it literally the same time, but I didn't even know it.
Depending on when it gets verified, he would mention he had to send a tape across the pond, to to Texas to get it verified and everything. So
that's right. Yeah, it was a lot harder. I mean, back when I was doing Twin Galaxies, before that, I was making VHS tapes and mailing them to people, and then you got to wait like 2 months for them to get to it and to see it get posted. But that's how we did it back then.
I'm curious, did you record any of your playthroughs or anything like that before you started submitting to SDA or to task videos or anything like that?
Yeah, I think there's still I still have a YouTube channel that's, hasn't been used in years. That's not my normal YouTube channel, where I think I uploaded a bunch of webcam footage of me doing at least Contra. There may be some Rock Band stuff. I can't remember if I uploaded any Double Dragon to it, but I still have all those. I still have some of the better recordings on some hard drive in a closet someplace, probably.
That's pretty awesome.
But yeah, I save everything that I ever did that was a world record is saved somewhere in a box somewhere in my house.
I'm glad you do that, because there are projects that many of us in the community are trying to get involved. One of them, it's funny you mentioned Task Videos. TaskBot is putting together a whole kind of compilation of everything associated with it, and it's tough because it's all in different places and stuff like that. But at some point, especially as we get better at archiving and history, and people like Summoning Salt and others putting together great histories of a particular run and stuff like that is invaluable. Finding the history of a world record or of a game, especially as more of us are getting interested in it. It's because it's helpful to see where we came from and what how all this stuff got started. What was the first game that you actually decided to speedrun?
Definitely, it was Contra. That was first. Then Double Dragon 2 after that. Then I think I did Double Dragon 1. These were not, other than Contra, I don't think Double Dragon 1 and 2 had proper speedruns at the time, so I didn't really have a target for them. I just wanted something that looked good and I felt like I didn't, that I executed at a high level and didn't make a lot of mistakes. Then I think after that, that's when I really started to look at what videos were up on SDA. Like, what can I beat? Like, at that point, I didn't want to just run something where I'm making this, where I'm just the only person doing it. I'm like, all right, I'm going to take some people down. So I started looking through, videos to find games that I really liked. And then I'm like, all right, I'm just going to beat every record for every game that I like. And so I did Bionic Commando, I did River City Ransom, I did Adventures of Lolo, I did Gauntlet, I just did, all 8-bit NES games and, all the ones that I really liked. I can't remember. There's a bunch of others among the early ones. But yeah, just one by one, just went through there and just beating record after record. I was kind of record hooked at that point.
As I research for different people who are nice enough to talk to me and things like that, I always love looking at SRC and just, that's a good place to start and see what you've done. And at this point, you've speedrun many games as you're talking about. How did you find the time for it back then? Were you still a student at this point? Or are you trying to have a day job? Because speedrunning can be a time-consuming type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I was all that I was in. Yeah, I was grad school for much of that, and then after I finished there, I was working in a research lab, and my hours were pretty flexible. But also, I didn't really, at that point in my life, I didn't really have a lot of hobbies much at that point. Maybe it's just because the gaming kind of took over the other hobbies, but so I really was just I would work and I would exercise and I would play games. That's like the three things that I did mostly. And
it's a great hobby, so yeah.
Sure. I mean, well, there was also I think a lot of us take for granted all the bingeable things that we can do now that didn't exist then. There was there was Netflix, but there wasn't like Netflix streaming service to the extent that it was. There was I don't think there was World of Warcraft. That was not a game that I ever got into. I never got into Call of Duty and things like that. And I think those games, having nothing, games or streaming services or things like that, there was really, there just was a lot more time. I mean, I didn't feel like it was ever crunched for time trying to speedrun. So.
I'm glad you mentioned that too, because you're right. That's a gaming period of time where maybe Quake Arena, some of these other games, but nothing like what we have now. And man, that Netflix thing is such a good point about there's so much good content out there nowadays.
Sure. I mean, things existed. I was playing like Action Quake and going on those servers and stuff like that. And I think, I don't know, probably like RuneScape was popular. Then there's a bunch of things. Diablo 3, I think was a lot of my friends were sinking time into that. But for whatever reason, I just kind of missed all those trends. And they weren't so aggressively marketed at that time. And game companies hadn't really figured out how to leverage the addictive properties of them. So it really wasn't as much of an attraction back in the middle of that decade that it is now. So there just was a lot more time, I thought.
I think that's really interesting to point out, and I think this is a good time to bring up. One of the ways that I was able to research for this conversation was you did a great panel at AGDQ 2019 about how SpeedGaming came about and things like that. And you mentioned, and you can see it if there's video of it. You attended the first GDQ. How do you get from doing speedrunning on your own, finding SDA, and then deciding to go attend this first GDQ event? How does that whole progression happen, and what's the community like at that point?
Okay, well, so we there was, I think there had been a couple of small meetups at MagFest, as in like a handful of people, 4 or 5 people from SDA, just kind of getting together and just hanging out as they did MagFest stuff. Because MagFest had been going on for quite a while. And that was kind of if you lived on the East Coast and were interested in retro games, that was probably like the only thing for you to do as far as live events go. But it was Mike Uyama had the idea to do classic games done quick. That was his brainchild. And he, at the time, he looked at who were the most active runners on SDA, who were the people who were most active among the submitters, people submitting new runs. And he just messaged us one by one and just said, hey, you run a bunch of games. We're doing this thing. Come to DC and do it. And I lived in North Carolina at the time, not too far from, it wasn't too far of a drive. It was like 5 hours. So, it was easy for me to drive up there. And so I did. I mean, anyone who knows the story of it knows how it started out as an event at MagFest, but then their internet didn't work, so they had to move everything over. It was actually kind of funny because I was driving up there and I got completely lost and I was like late and I was really like freaking out because I was supposed to be one of the first runs. I think I was like, 3 hours into the event was when I was supposed to do my run, and I was so late that I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? And I finally showed up, and it was after the time my run was supposed to start. And I'm thinking, oh gosh, I missed my chance. You had one job and you screwed it up. And then I got there and I bought a ticket to MagFest, and then I go over to where the thing was supposed to be, and there's no one there. And I'm like, uh-oh. And so then eventually I found Uyama's phone number, and I got the scoop for where we're supposed to be and made our way out there, and everything was fine. And so I did my run. I did, I think, 2 runs that night and 1 the next day. I can't remember if it was 1 and then 2 or 2 then 1, but I did my runs those 2 days and, hung out a little bit at the house. And, it was just, it was fun. I'd never done anything like that before, and obviously I'm glad I did.
Was there any other kind of community organization going on for live events at that point? Because I've been struggling to find anything. If any speedrunners got together live to do things at this point, and I've been struggling to find anything. I'm curious, had you been involved? I mean, you mentioned it's your first time you ever doing something like this. Was anything else like that going on though?
Yeah, I mean the only thing as I know of that, and I say retro games because like it was, I don't know, like that was really the things that people kind of focused around. Maybe there were, communities doing meetups relating to current games, but I was only following the retro game scene. So yeah, there was MagFest had their meetups, and they had a heavy focus on retro games at it. Let's see, and then I think that CGDQ itself was inspired by the Desert Bus for Hope charity event. I think that's what Mike saw that gave him the idea of doing CGDQ. And other than that, I don't. I think there was a group called the SpeedGamers. I think that's what it was.
Yeah.
That's where Lindsay
they were actually
Lane
there.
King,
they were at the event. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, and I think Lindsay Lane King came out of that, and probably some of the other people who are now part of the GDQ crew came from that. But other than that, I really don't know of any other event that was even. I mean, none of those things were speedrunning, but I don't think there was anything even remotely close other than those things. Not that I know of.
So, had you started streaming yet at this point? Had you started, doing any sort of like live presentation of your speedruns at this point? No,
not at all. Okay. It was all just me recording to VHS and then eventually to DVD. And then you send the results in and you wait for it to get verified. That's all. That's how it worked. There was no. Even like YouTube was barely a thing. It was only when I got into it, there was only a couple of years that YouTube had been in operation. So there wasn't really a good way to present it to the world. There were streaming services that existed at the time, but they weren't all that popular. The first time, I hadn't even thought about, like the first time when they did the CGDQ and streamed it, the first GDQ, they streamed it to Ustream, I think, which I hadn't even heard of. So after CGDQ happened, then nothing for a year, and then we did the first AGDQ at the 4-H Center a year later, 2011, I guess, January of 2011. And it was at that time that I realized, well, this is cool, I should stream. Because like at that time, a lot of people were just starting to stream. Everyone was on Ustream at the time. There was no... There was no Twitch, that didn't exist, and Justin TV did exist, the precursor to Twitch, but Ustream, for whatever reason, was the one that everyone was using at first. And yeah, so there at AGDQ 2011, I learned about Speedruns Live, and I learned about people streaming to Ustream. And after I went home from that, I said, all right, cool, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to start streaming. And so, yeah, that time in spring of 2011, I got a really cheap capture device. And at first I didn't have a microphone, but I got a microphone eventually. It was much later that I actually got a webcam. But yeah, I started streaming my attempts. I think I was working on Snake Rattle and Roll, I think was the first game I started streaming. There was probably a couple other things that I was doing at that time, but yeah, started streaming my attempts then. Mm-hmm.
Did you find it challenging to, add in some of those extra things to the stream that you weren't particularly doing, when you're recording the DVD, like talking and, having a chat and stuff? Was there a transition time at all for that?
Yeah, well, I mean, at first, when I started, there was no such thing as a stream layout. You were using like FMLV, I think, or
right.
It's some combination of letters. I can't remember. It's something like that. But it didn't even let you make a scene. You could stream one thing, which would be your capture, and then you could stream one audio track, which would be your mic. So that was it. There wasn't a stream. You couldn't even put a timer on the screen. You couldn't put a camera on the screen if you wanted to. It took more complex tools than that to be able to do that, or you had to build your layout in something else and then pipe it to FMLV.
I'm glad.
But yeah.
No, just to touch on that real quick, we did a GDQ episode where Mike Yama told us basically the stream back then too was there was the webcam stream, and then there was the game capture stream, and then because the VODs, they were all synced up, it looks great. It looks like it's a normal Twitch stream, but that's not exactly how it was actually streamed live at the time.
Yeah, it was, and you see you're right, and you see their layouts are really simple. It's just like,
right.
A camera, a game screen, and then like a row of text at the bottom that someone was actively typing in, and you could see it change as they typed in it.
Exactly.
Right, but yeah, so I started streaming that way, and it was cool. I actually found I took to it immediately. Like I loved it as soon as I did it, and I could actually get people talking to me in the chat. To give me some like feedback, and just it really helped to pass the time, because it got very boring doing the same thing over and over again in isolation. So as soon as I could have some interactions with people, I was super into it. And I remember it wasn't easy to talk and play at first. That was a skill that took a little time, but it came eventually. I remember that in 2012, AGDQ 2012, when I did my run there, I remember afterwards Mikey Yama said to me, wow, you really upped your commentary game. And like I think that it was because I had that year of just practicing talking and playing, and I was so I wasn't really able to commentate at all when I did my runs in 2010 and 2011. By 2012 it was all starting to come together.
I'm glad to hear you share that story, because I didn't start streaming speedrun attempts until 2017. But at that point, I actually, one of the reasons I chose to stream was to practice speaking kind of off the cuff and feeling comfortable talking in that scenario. At my day job, I was doing a lot of presentations, and I found myself struggling to kind of think on my feet sometimes. And that's one of those kind of like side benefits of streaming that you learn to speak, and because that's a valuable skill, especially if you're in a any professional scenario, So glad to hear that you had a similar experience.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's incredibly helpful for your confidence and just for your ability to think on your feet and to form words and such. I mean, I had a little bit of experience like giving some presentations and things for school related stuff, but it's not even on the same level. Like when you're a streamer, like especially when you're a speedrunner, you're trying to do something that's incredibly hard, that's at the very limits of human ability. And at the same time, you're having to talk to people, and you're like watching the chat, you're like watching your frame drops, you're like worrying about your timer, you're worrying about your splits, you're thinking about your strats, you're looking at your notes, and like you're dealing with like soul crushing disappointment over and over again, just being absolutely beaten up by this game that you're trying to play kind of at your limits, and you're dealing with like trolls in chat, and like all this, it really is this like crucible that you're in. And I think that if you can adapt yourself to be able to to perform under those conditions, you can do really anything. Like it doesn't, there's nothing you can't do if you're able to put up with that kind of pressure.
It's so true. I could not agree with you more. Such a good point. This actually kind of leads perfectly. So as you're speedrunning, and I think I actually don't know, but my first time viewing you was actually on your stream, probably around 14 or 15, probably somewhere around that time. And at this point, you're speedrunning Zelda 2. How did you discover, or when did you start speedrunning Zelda 2, and what led you to speedrun that game specifically?
Okay, well that probably came out of SRL. So around the time that I started getting into streaming, I also started getting into racing on SRL. And those were the early days of SRL, the very, very early days of SRL, when they, you could only do one race, only one race could be going on at a time. You didn't even have separate rooms for the various races. Mm-hmm. So you had to wait for other races to finish before you could start yours. It was all one channel. So
was that an IRC limitation, or is that just their...
No.
Wow.
No, it's not. I mean, it wasn't because of IRC. It's just because they implemented this really simple bot so they could do some... some casual races, and didn't really think that it was going to be a massive like multi-user kind of experience.
Right.
So but it blew up. It blew up huge in the early teens, in the early 2010s. It blew up huge, and so they had to retool everything. So I got into just playing whatever people were racing, and no one was actually racing Zelda 2, but there was one streamer called Chumlum, who I saw streaming Zelda 2, and that was the only person that I saw play that game. And I'm like, oh, that's right, Zelda 2. I forgot that game existed, but that was one of my favorite games when I was a kid. And so the weird thing is I started that not even intending to speedrun it. I just wanted to know, could I get through the Death Mountain in the dark? Because I thought that I'd seen like one person like on SDA run Death Mountain in the dark. I'm like, oh, that looks the most badass thing. Like you can't even see what's going on, and yet you can play these levels. And so I wanted to teach myself that. And so I just went through with save states, and I just did all the rooms, all the dark rooms, and I practiced. And so then me and Chum would just end up racing Zelda 2 a bunch. We raced a whole bunch of times, but I only wanted to do like race to get the hammer and stuff like that. I only wanted to do just like short goals because I wanted to do this Death Mountain stuff. But then eventually I'm like, all right, we'll do the whole game. And so we kind of took it a little bit from there, and then other people started playing Zelda 2, so I had more people to race against. But racing things on SRL was a big focus of mine around that time, and I think for the better. I think it really helped me as a player.
There's something about racing others, and I didn't know this until I actually went, raced on SRL myself against others playing some bonk games. There is, it's friendly, obviously, and it's great that you're playing a game usually against somebody who enjoys the game just as much as you do. But it pushes you to like better yourself, and it's one of the speedrunning can kind of be one of those things where you're working in a bubble sometimes, where you're on your own, you're working to improve yourself and stuff like that. So it's fun to share that experience, and I'm glad to hear that it's kind of the thing that kind of pushed you into running Zelda 2 a little bit more. Just to let you know a little bit of my personal experience, I think whenever the year ProJN ran Zelda 2, I think it was 15 or 14, somewhere around there, but that's what kind of led me into speedrunning, and that's how I found your stream at that time and everything. And so I wouldn't be speedrunning today if it weren't for you and ProJN and some of these other people at the time. And so how long did you spend with the game? Because it seems like it's the game you spent more time with than others, but I don't know for sure. So I wanted to ask about that. It's
one of the ones I spent, that I ended up coming back to multiple times. Because most of the games I was doing around that time was like I had a goal. I wanted to beat the record. Like I had a run that I saw, and I'm like, okay, I want to find better strats and train myself better and beat that person. And so I would do it, and it would take a month and a half. And then I'd be done with the game. Maybe I'd run it at a GDQ, and then I'd be done with it.
Right.
But Zelda 2, I came back to over and over again just because, A, it had a lot of categories, B, it had a really high skill ceiling, and C, there was just a lot of people. Well, there was starting to be more and more people who were interested in it. And then, of course, you had a bunch of really good runners came out to the scene. ProJN, Simple Dude in particular were really crushing it. That made me want to keep coming back to that more so than other games that I would kind of like do them and drop them.
I'm glad you mentioned the skill ceiling of it as well. It is a challenging game, yet it's so fulfilling and rewarding. I guess for me, the thing I love about it so much is just the way that it feels in the fingers. I find it incredibly responsive, and I know there are times where it can feel a bit cheap or a bit trolly, to say the least. The Castlevania type things where you hit back and things like that. But the controls just still to this day still feel really responsive and really good in the fingers.
Oh yeah, that absolutely. There's a reason why it's so it's such a high skill ceiling. But I mean, it controls amazing. Like people kind of like to trash on Zelda 2 just because it's so different.
Right,
but
it's so different.
I defy you to find a better like 2D side scroller that like with a sword. Like the sword combat and that is so good. The way you could, they have just the right amount of momentum that you could do stuff like jump and then turn around in the air and slash behind you. You could turn around really quickly. You could switch between high and low, both on the ground and in the air, high and low strikes. You'd use your shield. The way you bounce off of things, like the way the hitboxes were implemented, lets you bounce and boost off of things really easily, both damage boosting and like attack, and like hitting something and bouncing off with your attack. They're just whatever that they did. I mean, they really like nailed it as far as really good play control. Like if you play that game and then play Battle of Olympus, like play those two back to back. And as much as I love Battle of Olympus, like you play that and you're like, oh, it's a Zelda 2 like game. But no, it does not feel. It feels like it's like 10 times as clunky as Zelda 2 is. It's just like they made it so smooth in Zelda 2 that it's really hard to compare anything to it.
Well, I've been playing a bunch of Zelda 2 ROM hacks recently, and they mentioned I haven't played Battle of Olympus yet, and I've been told that's the game you got to try just because of the comparisons and things. But as you're mentioning, I think it's a challenge to. I haven't played an NES game that controls any 8-bit game. I should point out this. I put this point that controls the way that Link does with a sword. You're correct in this game. It just makes it so good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So one of the things I guess I'd like to steer our conversation then to is at some point you got to realize or see the community aspect of what's going on, because as watching through your panel again at AGDQ, you talk about how you decided to start community organizing, for lack of a better term. And how does that idea start? Where do you get the idea to start try something organizing yourself?
I think I hadn't really done much organizing in the community up to the point that I started Sunday Sequence Break. The only real community focused things I'd done was I made a bot for SRL that tracked stats and did different things. Before the joke bot was made, I had a bot that did kind of similar things. But the first time I really did anything kind of on a broader scale was through Sunday Sequence Break, and that was all Flicky. He was Flicky approached me at, we became friends at HDQ 2012, I think. And we hung out a lot there and had a great time. And then, like not long after it was over, he messaged me and he messaged PJ, and it was me and PJ and I think maybe Duckfist, or maybe he came later, I don't remember. But he basically messaged some people and he's like, hey, we're starting a podcast. I'm like, okay, cool. I've never done that before. Sounds good. And so that really was kind of the start of trying to do something broader than just a single person project. And it was a lot of fun. We met a lot of people. That's where I really started to develop connections in the community, because we would have guests on every week and people would send their world records to us so we could talk about them. And so that's when that's when I started to get a lot of practice doing better streams, because most of them I would run the broadcast. And some of them Duckfist ran, but eventually after Duckfist left, it was mostly me, and started to develop some of the automation and some of the tools that eventually were to inspire the tools that I used for SpeedGaming and things that we use today. But yeah, I'd say Sunday Sequence Break really kind of took it up to the next level. Yeah, from there. Mm-hmm.
I'm really glad that you've left the Sunday Sequence Break on YouTube and Twitch and some other places to go back and revisit the speedrunning scene and the speedrunning community at that time. I'd love to clarify. I didn't, when I started Googling and searching for podcast name when I started my podcast over a year ago, Sequence Break didn't come up. It's not listed on iTunes, and that's where you go first. Blah blah. And I'm so thankful that somebody, once I was about 9 or 10 episodes in, pointed this out, because I felt like I had just discovered this treasure trove of information and what it was like to be in the scene at that time. Can you tell us a little bit about the podcast? What were you? I mean, you were covering speedrunning, but I mean, it was like a weekly news thing. Where you mentioned you had guests on. What was kind of the idea for the podcast?
Yeah, so it was a two-part format. So one part would be basically a news thing, but mostly world record. It was world record news. So people would submit their world records. At first, it was just us looking at, we would just pay attention to the news feed at SDA, or we'd pay attention to what's going on in the forums, and we would, come up with, our rundown of what happened this week. And we did it weekly. Every Sunday evening we did it. And then eventually, it didn't take long before we, put up a submission form so people could send their own records in. And we would get so many of them. We would get like over 100 submissions each week, to the point where it was just becoming a huge amount of work to process them all and get them into our spreadsheet. And I made the highlight compilations. So we would have clips of most of the runs, not all the runs, but a lot of the runs. We'd have clips, and we'd make these highlight reels that we would play while we went through them. So we would go through a list of all the runs. We would just say the runner, say the record, say the time, and the category. And then if we had a clip of it, we would play a little clip while we talked about it. And we would kind of, talk about the clip and, look at whatever clever things were going on in it. And then the second half of the show would be a deep dive into one particular game. So we would have a guest come on, and they would, who was an expert in something, usually world record holder in some game, and we would just spend like an hour talking about that game with them. And we would play one of their runs, or one or two of their runs, and the person would just sort of talk about what's going on in the run. And that was the first experience that I really had with trying to commentate, or working with someone as they commentated their run in an offline sense, not just like a live stream kind of commentary, but like one where they're actually thinking about and explaining in some depth what's going on.
My guess is that because we speedrun, we enjoy the details and how we break apart games and find new ways to do things in interesting ways. I never get tired of hearing people talk about the game that they're into and speedrunning it, and deconstructing it, and then figuring out a way to do this and that. And that's it's definitely, it's not the same as watching somebody run live, but it has its own unique interest to it. And it's great to hear how people think and what they were, what's the approach. What does this mean? So it's nice that this, I don't know if you, but I'm pretty sure you guys were probably the first speedrun podcast, because I can't find anything earlier than that. So it's kind of this moment in time that I'm glad you've left up there for archival purposes and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I don't think there was a speedrun podcast before that.
So how does that lead into SpeedGaming, or at least, bringing some communities together to do events and races and tournaments and things like that?
Yeah, well, it was a lot of steps, or a very gradual process, but Sunday Sequence Break was definitely the motivation, because it was, I was getting, super duper into racing. I was doing so much racing on SRL. I really loved it. But I wanted to try some new stuff. I wanted to try some things that hadn't been done before. So I had this idea to do what we called SpeedGaming League. And that's where the name SpeedGaming actually came out of, SpeedGaming League. And the idea was to have a competition where we leveled the playing field, and it was not about, how many years have you worked on the game. It was just about like how fast do you learn a game. So the way it would work is we had a combination of things happening. We would give out like 3 games per week, or 3 games per episode. So there'd be an episode a week in advance. We would get the players lined up. We'd get 4 players, and we would give them 3 games, and each of the games would be a short goal, a goal that could be completed in like 2 to 5 minutes. And then they would have, actually, we didn't tell them all the games. We told them some of the games, and they would have some of the games they knew about in advance, and some of them they only learned of the day of the show. And so they would practice, they would do some practicing. So we had we had long, like a 1 week practice and a 1 hour practice. Those were the two kinds of competitions. So we would give them a game and a goal, and they would, spend a week developing strats for it. And we would pick obscure games that we were sure nobody had played. Because back then, games that, most games didn't really have any kind of speedrun strats or any kind of speedrun scene whatsoever. So it wasn't too hard to do that. And we would, and players would be on their honor system to let us know if they had ever actually speedrun the game before. So they would have a week to practice, and then an hour before the show started, we would give them another game, which would be their 1 hour practice, and they would spend an hour practicing that. And then we would do the episode, and they would do just a combination of, they would have a half an hour to try to get the best time they could. Basically half an hour to do attempts of whatever these goals were, and we would keep track of, what their time was, and we would display it on the screen, and the players would just kind of go at it and just try to they could do as many attempts as they want. They could reset anytime they want. So it was very much like speedrunning and not like a race, in that you're going for the best time. You're not racing against someone. You have a fixed period of time, and you're just trying to basically do attempts until you get a better time than the other person. And so that I thought was cool. I thought it was, there certainly wasn't anything like that at the time. Not really even very much like that.
I was going to say, you don't see anything really like that today, but it's a great format. Like that's kind of gets at the heart of what speedrunning is,
Yeah, it was the idea. I wanted to try to boil it down to what is the essence of speedrunning if you were to subtract out the fact that, some people have different amounts of experience than others. Right. Like I wanted just to get at the raw talent. And I actually think that it did it quite effectively. I would have kept doing it, except it was just a tremendous amount of work to make one of those episodes happen. And I couldn't do that plus Sunday sequence break plus my own speed running plus all the other things in my life. So that eventually it went 2 seasons or something like that, or I forget, 1 or 2 seasons, and then it was no more. But
but I mean, I'm sure it gave you a lot of experience, at least on what does it take to put on something of that nature. I'm glad you highlighted too, like there are still today a lot of volunteering in what we do, and yes, some people have made professions out of this, and thankfully they can have a living and stuff. But for others, a lot of events that happen are still volunteer driven or volunteer based, and it takes a tremendous amount of effort and hours. As I've volunteered for GDQs, Cali, a bunch of other things, and you can't underestimate the amount of people and time it takes to do some of these things. So it sounds like that's something you might have learned on the way.
Yeah, it was more work than I would have ever expected, and I think it was worth it. And I learned a lot of things, and I learned how to work with people, and I learned how to sort of organize a project of that kind. And really, it definitely laid the foundation for what would later become SpeedGaming in its current form. It wouldn't have happened if we hadn't started with SpeedGaming League. I got to say, speed gaming is somewhat ubiquitous now, and we've seen kind of the proliferation of events and tournaments and channels that are dedicated to this stuff. When speed gaming actually, when you founded it or started the channel, was there anything else out there like that? Was there that kind of thing out there? I don't know if there may have been a community channel for something. I'm not sure. Like it was mostly, there may have been a couple other streams, 1 or 2 other streams that were more than just one person, but it was mostly still just personal streams. I certainly didn't have anything in particular that I saw that inspired me to make, a channel that shows a variety of content other than GDQ. That's probably the only thing that was really a group organized stream. Yeah, I'd say so.
What have been some of your highlights for some of the events and tournaments you've hosted on SpeedGaming at this point?
Oh gosh, it's been so many. I don't know where to begin. I mean, a lot of the really early ones I thought were it just amazed me that we were able to do it. I remember our first Super Metroid tournament that we ever did, and our first Link to the Past tournament. Those were before Link to the Past randomizer even existed. Their first like vanilla Link to the Past tournament was really a big deal for us when we did it. But probably the thing that really started, that kind of ramped up what we were doing, we eventually so SpeedGaming transitioned from the Sunday Sequence Break channel to the SpeedGaming channel sometime in the early teens, and we did SpeedGaming League on there, but we had this whole channel that we had nothing to do with, like nothing else to do on it when we weren't doing SpeedGaming League episodes. And then there was Zelda 2. There was a Zelda 2 tournament, and then I think Zelda 1 tournament. I think were among the first ones. And we said, all right, I was like, hey, what the heck? I'll put a few. I can put a few episodes on here. I can restream something besides just SpeedGaming League. Let's see what happens. And so some of those early ones that we did, I think, really stuck with me. I remember just really enjoying sitting there, running watching the broadcast. I'd set it up and just watch these players go, and it was just amazing to see that all funneling through my computer and out to the world. Yeah.
Good. No, good.
No, I mean those were the good ones.
What I was, I've mentioned it a couple times, but folks, if you haven't watched the AGDQ 2019 panel that feasel and the entire, many of the team did, it's really interesting and provides quite a bit of insight. You mentioned during the panel that you had, over the course of SpeedGaming, a lot of tools have been developed by you or others for just specifically for what you do. And I was curious, do you have some sort of background in software engineering or things like that? Like, how did you have the technical knowledge to build out some of these tools that you've talked about to make SpeedGaming possible and all of these events possible?
Yeah, I mean, programming. That's my my background is in computer science, and so it was definitely a lot of. We're joined by some friends here. There was definitely a lot of programming went into it, and that was sort of the. I don't think I would have been able to do it if I didn't have that skill, because that's a hard thing to find volunteers to write tools for you. So the fact that I could do that myself was a big deal. But yeah, so we started out. I wrote some tools. Well, Duckfist wrote some stuff to do, to run some Sunday sequence break, and then eventually he left the team, and I wrote some more tools to help with the automation. But then once we got into SpeedGaming League. That's when I wrote the first rendering tool, the first thing that actually drew the broadcasts on the screen or drew the streams, the player streams onto the broadcast window, and actually, had some automation behind it, and the layout would update automatically with the player names, and the code that I wrote for that, some of it still exists today in SpeedGaming's code base, some of it survived all those years. And so that was really where it started. And then the stuff that we did for SGL, for SpeedGaming League, got more and more complex, and I was writing more and more tools. So by the time we were ready to move into doing general purpose broadcasting, we already had a base from which to start.
Speaking of the team, Mythical 9 is in the chat and says Speed Kitty. So
Hey, there we go.
We had an appearance. That's super interesting, and the reason I brought it up is because there are many speedrunners now that I've met that have this background in computer science or coding and development and all those kind of things, and I'm always curious, what is it about the background in engineering that seems to just lend itself so well to speedrunning? I'm not quite sure. Do you ever thought about that or noticed that exists in our community?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's something about the analytical nature of those two things that make them kind of similar, but I also see a lot of people who are brilliant speedrunners and brilliant strat finders and stuff that have zero background whatsoever of a technical sort, so I don't know if it's exclusively the thing that does it. But I think a big thing was if you grew up in the 80s and 90s, you were... that was the rise of video games. That was when the video game generation really started, and I think that inspired a lot of people to go into engineering and computer science. And I know that for me, I spent my childhood trying to write video games. That's all I wanted to do was just write video games. Like most of the programs that I was writing at a young age were just I wanted to write games. And so I bet that a lot of people, who grew up with video games at whatever age that they started were kind of inspired from the games that they played to want to create video games, or at least create something software-wise.
That is so interesting you mentioned that. I'm not a developer by any means, but I do remember, in the early 90s and being on DOS and you're playing the games, but the first time I loaded up BASIC and I was able to get the computer to say hello or say my name back, there is something just as magical about that as there is, the first coming out of the, starting up a Zelda game, it's, there is absolutely something about that.
Yeah.
So cool. So what is SpeedGaming nowadays? I mean, it seems like there's an infinite amount of SpeedGaming channels, and it seems like we've seen a wonderful growth of the channel, but also of the community events and those type of things. How many tournaments and events are you able to host nowadays?
Oh gosh, at any given time, we probably have a couple dozen that are in the process. Most of the events that we do, most of the tournaments that we do last, a good 2 to 3 months, 2.5 months maybe. Depends what it is. Some of them shorter. So they overlap quite a bit. And yeah, we probably have a couple dozen things going at a time. We've done, I think in total, we've done, I don't know, I did a tally the other day and I can't even remember what the number is, but we've done hundreds of events in the last 5 years or so that we've been in operation. 6 years, I think, now that we've been in operation. We've done done hundreds, probably, maybe over 1,000. I'm not sure.
And one of the things that this shouldn't surprise me, but it sort of did. I'm always curious, like, hey, how do these events end up? Is SpeedGaming like thinking of these ideas and going to the communities, or is the community, going to you? Like, how does that? Now I know, but I mean, I'm curious how the process works today. If somebody wants to do that,
right? Well, the initially it was sort of a combination of. There actually weren't a lot of tournaments before SpeedGaming started doing its thing. There weren't a lot of tournaments, even like non-restreamed tournaments. There had been a couple that people had done on SRL fairly informally. I think there was there was a Mario 3 tournament. I think Zelda 2 was, I can't remember if they had done one before the one that we started restreaming or not, but there was a few, but not really very much. And so in the early days, it was a combination of people seeing that, hey, there's a channel that we could host a tournament on, and it was actually us just going out there pounding the pavement and like finding people to do and organizing our own tournaments and finding people to do that, or finding people to join our tournaments. So it's a little bit of both. But as time went on, it became less and less necessary for us to make up our own tournaments or to like initiate our own tournaments, just because like now I think people are very much more like tournament minded, and they think, as soon as they get enough people, they want to try to do a tournament just because they see so many of them. So we don't really have to go out there looking for tournaments. They kind of come to us at this point. So it's pretty rare that we decide on our own to host something, that we're initiating.
Well, and I'm glad to hear that exists. Like, if a community wants to see their tournament or their event there, they can, you have your email address right on your Twitter. I mean, it's like, it makes it something that we could pursue. Cause I know I have met many people who feel somewhat similar to me, where we're passionate about our game, we're passionate about our community, we'd love to share it with others, and SpeedGaming really does provide that outlet for that, which is, I think it's pretty cool. It's pretty amazing. You can take on as many events as you can. It's really surprising.
Yeah, and I think that it really helps that we generally don't say no to stuff. I mean, it's always been my philosophy and our philosophy at SpeedGaming that we don't make our decision based on how popular we think the game is, or how much we like the game, or even how good a speedrun it is. We'll like everything deserves to be speedrun, and we don't try to, we don't say, that's, that game is too stupid, we're not going to do it, or there just aren't enough people that are going to watch it. So we will, we don't make our decisions based on that. We don't even decide our channel assignments based on that. We really don't try to put, more popular games on the lower numbered channels. It's just sometimes it happens that way, but just by chance. But it's not at all intended to be, a popularity contest. So we really do like it to be about, just showing off the game itself, not about like what's going to get views. And I think that maybe that has some attraction to people as well, that you can run some really obscure game that very few people run, and we're still interested in doing your tournament.
I think that's an important distinction. We talk about GDQ a lot on this podcast, and they are very upfront about they're trying to raise as much money as they possibly can for charity. So they're going to make their decisions based around that. Here is your whole thing is about showcasing and highlighting the wonderful things that are happening in speedrunning. I think that provides a really it gets us games that are tournaments that we might not otherwise see, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, well, I mean, I came up playing some really obscure and sometimes awful games, so I couldn't. Be pretty hypocritical of me to turn something down because I didn't like the game.
That's totally fair. For those that have been watching the video of this, I've been showing some of your older GDQ appearances and things like that. And this right now it's your AGDQ 2013 run of Zelda 2. One of my favorites. One of the things that captured my imagination, got me into speedrunning. At some point, you end up being a person who's on air and who's interviewing people. How did that process, or how did that come about? How did that happen? How did we find you eventually hosting things and interviewing people at GDQ?
Let's see. Someone from GDQ approached me. It was probably Darkman, I think. I think it was Darkman who approached me. But someone just messaged. I was part of the original team for that, so they approached a couple of people and just asked them, and I said sure. But it was probably just based on the fact that I was a prolific runner and had done a lot of runs in GDQ and had been going to it since the start. So I think it was just those factors and that got me picked along with a couple other people.
There's this thing, from your podcast, from seeing you do these interviews on GDQ and things like that, you seem to really be interested, and it's really engaging to watch you do some of these things. Is there something about meeting people or at least interviewing people and talking with others that piques your interest? Because you do the job very well, and I'm curious if there's something behind that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe it kind of harkens back to Sunday Sequence Break, just kind of a little bit of a throwback to that. But I don't know, I just find it fascinating hearing other people's perspectives, I guess. And I also like challenge. I like, I just like having, something kind of technical to do. It's nice. I mean, really, it's just, it gives me like another way of interacting with speedrunning, I guess, besides just as an event organizer or as an actual runner.
Absolutely. At this point, we're here now in 2021. When's the last time you actually did a speed run yourself, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, it's been a while. I mean, I kind of retired once. I was for a while both running my own stream and running SpeedGaming, but I couldn't really do both for very long because it was just becoming a huge drain on time to do both of those things. And ultimately, I figured probably if I was going to make Twitch a living, it would not be. I mean, I couldn't do both. I was,
Right.
if I wanted to make one of my living, and I'm thinking just like probably with my skill set, I might do better as an organizer than as just a player, and maybe some considerations of like, what's it going to do to my hands if I have to play games 8 hours a day every day? I'm not a young man, so it's like, things like I like the idea that I don't have to. That I can actually be like running a business without having to be on the air 100% of the time. So it's kind of nice to be able to create something that still has momentum, even if you're sleeping or even if you're having a day off or, even if your focus is on something else.
That's
yeah.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's come up a couple of times with people who've done full-time streaming as their job. That they do think about the fact that if they're not on the air, the company or the business isn't running.
Right,
so
exactly.
that could totally a concern. I could totally understand that.
Yeah, and that it's tough to keep a streamer schedule, and I was never very good
yeah.
at keeping a regular schedule and just being consistent about things. And I think that was kind of maybe one of the things that kind of limited my success as a streamer. In that, you gotta, there's a bunch of things you gotta do, and one of them is consistency. This is the most important thing.
I can't imagine when you'd find time for this nowadays, but have you ever considered or thought about speedrunning a game again?
I think about it from time to time. I just don't have a project that I am passionate about doing. I think I was always very much driven by this idea of like, oh, there's this game and I see this world record, but I can think of a thing that this person didn't. I'm going to see if I can develop that and actually do something with it. And I just don't, in the absence of having something like that, not being able to make some kind of technical contribution to the game, there's a lot less desire to actually go do it. Without that aspect of it. And I'm sure that there are things, if I were to put some time into like doing some research and looking around, I'm sure I could find things that would. It's just that I just haven't done that.
No, it makes sense. That part of the brain doesn't go away.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. Do you still get the chance to casually game at all? Have there been any games you've played in the last 3 or 4 years that you enjoy?
Oh my goodness. The sad part is I really don't get to play much of anything. I mean, I'm sure I could, but
Right.
I'm kind of taking a little break from it, I guess. I really don't do a lot of gaming on my own. Yeah, to be honest, when I have time, whenever, it's like one of those things where like if you work as like a baker, the last thing you want to do is like eat baked goods when you get home. It's like I'm working as, I'll like when I'm not working, I like get away from the computer and I'd like try to get outside. I try to do something else. Sometimes I end up just like watching YouTube at random for hours. But either way, I try to. It's maybe a little too close to home if I were to stop, organizing video game stuff and then go play video games immediately after. It just doesn't seem like as much of a break as it should,
I totally get it. I'm glad to hear that you do take the break because that could start trying on the mental health pretty quick. If it's for those of us that did, I know it would affect me that way. So
sure, and sitting all day is so bad for you.
Oh,
you
yeah,
don't want
no
to sit
kidding.
all day. You got to get up and get around a little bit.
If there's one thing I've learned during COVID, because I've had to do my day job from this chair, it's that you need to get up at least every hour. Just walk around, take a lap, do something. It's so bad for you just sitting all the time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So what's next for you? I mean, obviously SpeedGaming seems to be going still strong. Is there anything you'd like to see in the future or anything you'd like to do next?
Next, man, I don't know. Like, I haven't really thought about what I would do after SpeedGaming, or if that even makes sense to describe it that way. I mean, I think SpeedGaming has enough of has enough momentum behind it, and right now there's enough other people. I have staff members that are just immensely talented that really could just run this without me, and so I feel like it's got enough of a life on its own that I'm pretty confident in it. If I really, I don't know. I like, first and foremost, I do think of myself as an engineer. I mean, I like making events. I like organizing events, but more than anything else, I like making tools, and I like seeing what cool things can I create. And so probably what I try to work on every moment I get is writing more tools and writing better tools and improving what we have, because what people do with speedrunning has just expanded so much in years, and just continues to. So I really just want to adapt SpeedGaming's tools to be able to do more things, just to be able to have better looking broadcasts, to have things run more smoothly. I get really fascinated by helping groups of people operate efficiently. I feel like it's kind of fun to not just to program code, but to also program with people, coming up with ways for people to interact with each other effectively, and send messages to each other effectively, and make things run really smoothly. And I just love the idea of using automation for things, using image recognition to all kinds of projects that I could do with image recognition to enhance the broadcasts. I would love to work on stuff like that. I think that getting a mobile apps involved, so that maybe runners have an interface that they can start their race with that runs on your phone, or there's all kinds of various things. And there's all these new formats that people are using, all these multi-world stuff and massive multiplayer Super Metroid games, and all these new things that people are starting to do. So I kind of want to try to just incorporate all these new things into what SpeedGaming does as best I can. So yeah, that's kind of what I got in mind.
I gotta ask, when you started in speedrunning over a decade ago now, did you ever imagine that it would grow to what it has become at this point?
Yeah, no, I had no clue that that would happen, because there wasn't people just weren't streaming. They weren't streaming back in 2007, 2008. It just wasn't a thing. And even when it started to be a thing, there was no avenue to monetize yourself back in those in those years either. That didn't happen until much later. So I don't think anyone expected it was going to blow up to the extent it did. And I don't know, it's hard to say whether it was, GDQ that, really brought speedrunning into the public eye, or if it was kind of the other way around, speedrunning just gained momentum on its own, and therefore that helped GDQ boost. But I think they very much both helped each other. I mean, GDQ did a massive amount of good for kind of solidifying people's interests and bringing it to the public in a way that's digestible and understandable. And then Twitch, Justin TV turning into Twitch, who Twitch had, great plans for, how to make the platform better. I think that helped a lot as well. And yeah, I mean, all those things just caused it to blow up. But I had no idea back in the day that was going to be a thing at all. To me, it was just a hobby. It's just a thing to do. Other people, learn to play sports or play musical instruments and whatnot. And I figure I'm just going to learn to beat games fast. And I figured that that's all it would ever be, really. But yeah, surprise.
The more people I speak with, the more I think what I'm piecing together is maybe it's a combination of all those things just happening at the right time. Especially, when viral videos started to happen and people could share videos and things like that, that seemed to help the proliferation of speedrunning. I'm in my late 30s. Our generation being old enough to to purchase some of these old games if we didn't have them in the first place. Like, there's just all these things happening. It seemed like at the right time to kind of create what we've seen now. Even though there's plenty of young people in speedrunning, obviously, as well. I mean, in fact, some of the top runners are basically people way younger than me. So it's I think it's kind of interesting to note some of those things. And it always still cracks me up to hear that the fact that what it was. There's I haven't met anybody yet who could have seen what it ended up or what it would end up becoming. It seems like everyone's still pretty surprised by it.
Yeah, I really think it was a bunch of things happening at the same time, because I don't think it was a change in technology that made it come about.
Right,
because,
right.
Like, compare 2014 to 2008. Everyone had mobile phones.
Yes.
Everyone had computers that would have been good enough to stream.
Emulators were around. Those are still there.
Nothing new. It's not like people didn't have broadband. Like, nothing new
Yes.
changed technology wise that would have made this happen. I think it was just a couple of actors, maybe GDQ doing its thing, Twitch doing its thing, maybe YouTube to some extent blowing up did its thing, and just came together to made it all work out.
It really did, and I appreciate you kind of taking us down that memory lane. I really enjoy piecing together and finding out more and more about the history, and I feel like I've only still scratched the surface. So thanks for reliving some of these moments and taking us through it a little bit. And honestly, I know it sounds kind of weird, but thanks for being involved back then, because I know myself and many others, we wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for people like you. Back then, not being afraid to get in front of thousands of people and share your speedruns at a GDQ, things like that. Where can people find SpeedGaming if they want to get in, if they want to watch the stream, or if they want to organize an event? What's the easiest way to find SpeedGaming?
Yeah, I mean, if you just go to twitch.tv/SpeedGaming, that would be our main channel. We have SpeedGaming 2, 3, 4, etc. up to 6, and then we have language channels: SpeedGaming Espanol, SpeedGaming Portuguese, SpeedGaming Francais, SpeedGaming Deutsch, and those each have a 2. You can also put a 2 after it to get to a second channel. Our website is speedgaming.org, which is currently under construction or under revamping, to which hopefully by mid 2021 you'll see the new version of it, which will look better. Hopefully, we'll see.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. And yeah, that's probably it. And if you have anything that you can always find me on Discord. Our Discord server is discord.gg/speedgaming. And our email address is ask@speedgaming.org. So that's usually the easiest way for people who have a new tournament that they want. Just contact us there, and we'll get in touch with you.
Feasel, honestly, I can't thank you enough for taking this time and sharing just these stories and things like that. So thank you so much. And I look forward to hopefully at some point getting a chance to see everyone here at a live event at some point in the future, if it'll ever happen again. So
yeah, thank you.
Thanks everyone for listening, watching, viewing, liking, subscribing, and sharing. All of that stuff goes a long way to helping out the podcast. If you'd like any additional info, you can go to sequencebreakpodcast.com. All of our past episodes, everything's on there. You'll find everything there. If you'd like to watch live, follow the Sequence Break Twitter. That is Sequence Break PC, and you can join in, ask some questions, watch the whole thing live. It does happen. It's not really a set time, but I do post when I go live. Everything else, if you have any questions or anything like that, podcast@sequencebreakpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.